Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on building resiliency in supply chains. My name is Vish Vishwanathan, and I'm a professor at the Nanyang Business School in NTU. My research interests and expertise are in operations management, supply chain management, and corporate sustainability. Before I introduce the panelists for today's discussion, let me give you a brief introduction to global supply chains. Supply chains have become very globalized over the last 30 to 40 years. For example, if you consider a large aircraft like a Boeing Dreamliner or a A380, the parts of the aircraft come from over 1,500 companies from over 30 countries. One of the reasons for this is, of course, the huge complexity of the product itself and the specific competencies that exist in different firms in different countries. However, the primary reason for such scale of globalization in most companies is to pursue cost efficiencies. Added to this is the fact that global transport and logistics have become extremely efficient in terms of cost in the past 50 years. So, for example, if you go into the supermarket in any country, in most countries in the world, on the shelves, you would find produce and products from all around the globe. Of course, it's an entirely different matter what the negative externalities in terms of CO2 emissions are caused by these global logistics. But that's perhaps a discussion for another day, or maybe towards the end of this webinar itself. When you look at global manufacturing supply chains, companies tend to work with fewer and fewer suppliers for specific components and parts. And this has happened primarily because of the fact that most companies around the world have very well imbibed the lean and operations excellence concepts that were pioneered by the Japanese manufacturing companies in the 70s and 80s. So what the lean and operational excellence concepts encourage companies to do is work with fewer suppliers for specific parts, and then you can focus on continuous improvement, and in that process achieve continuous efficiency improvements in cost over a long period of time. However, these operational excellence and cost efficiency strategies itself lead to resiliency issues when the supply chains are disrupted. For example, when severe floods occurred in Thailand in the second half of 2011, and Thailand is known as the Detroit of Asia, or at least Southeast Asia, supply chains of many Japanese automakers, including Toyota Corolla, were severely disrupted. At the same time, many of the electronic companies of the world also had their supply chains disrupted. Earlier in the same year, there was the Tohoku earthquake and the tsunami that ensued as a result of the earthquake. And again, the supply chains of many Japanese manufacturing companies were disrupted. And we have had several such similar incidents, maybe of smaller scale, over the last 20 to 25 years. Whenever such an event occurs, people in the field, that is the supply chain professionals, as well as some of the senior corporate leaders, start discussing about the topic of managing supply chain disruptions. But the discussions are only for among the supply chain professionals and some of the corporate leaders. It has never become a Main Street issue as such. That is until this year. Of course, we know what happened during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic in countries. The supermarket shelves were running out of stocks in almost all the countries when the panic struck. And supply chain resiliency now has become a lexicon or vocabulary that is used by the Main Street, right? So how do we build resiliency in supply chains? And that is the topic for today's panel discussion. So we have three excellent senior corporate leaders joining us in the panel discussion today. So first, I'm going to introduce each one of them. Our first panelist, I'll introduce the lady in the panelist first, is Ms. To Hui Leng. Hui Leng is a proud alumna of NTU. She's an accountancy graduate and from NTU Business School, as well as a chartered accountant. And she was in the accounting and finance field for a long time. She has been with NTUC FairPrice also for a long time. And now she's the Chief Supply Chain Officer at FairPrice. She's also the Chief Executive Officer of Grocery Logistics of Singapore, which is a subsidiary of NTUC. And she's responsible for leading FairPrice's supply chain operations team to ensure deliveries to all the FairPrice outlets, as well as those who are Singaporeans will know the Cheers outlets that are there next to most of the ExxonMobil gas stations, right? She was instrumental in transforming the manual logistics operation to a highly automated one. Those who are experts in warehouse management and logistics will know strategies like pick to light and integrated ASRS, and she's an expert in all those things. Welcome to this panel discussion, Hui Leng, and thank you very much for sparing your time with us. The second speaker I'd like to introduce is Mr. Niam Chi Haur. Chi Haur is also a proud NTU alumnus from the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. He graduated with an undergraduate degree from NTU and then did a MBA. He is the director of strategic sourcing at McDonald's in their global supply chain and sustainability team. Specifically, he focuses on the design, development, and implementation of sourcing strategy for poultry across the entire value chain in Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Africa. He has also spent a significant amount of time in other FMCG companies, food and beverage companies, such as Yum Brands, where he was in a senior supply chain management position, supporting the supply chain for 13 different Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC markets, right? So before that, he has also worked in the what I would like to call the erstwhile Hewlett-Packard company before pre-merger, maybe 20 years ago, maybe it was post-Compaq days, I guess. And he's also worked in Microsoft, and both in Hewlett-Packard and Microsoft, he has worked in areas such as manufacturing, quality, and procurement. So welcome, Chi Haur, and thank you to you as well for spending your precious time with us.
Thank you,
Our third speaker, a third panelist for today is Edward Davis. Ed is a strategy director of digital manufacturing at HP Inc., the new HP Inc. He has over 30 years experience in printing technology and product development in printing technology. So Ed is an expert in manufacturing, in product lifecycle, in design through manufacture and product assembly and use. Ed is also involved with us in the HP NTU corporate lab. In fact, both Ed and I are co-investigators in a project involving end-to-end supply chain design for additive manufacturing, and specifically we are looking at building resiliency in supply chains. So thank you, Ed, for again spending your precious time with us, and welcome to the panel discussion.
Thank you.
Before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to remind the audience and invite the audience to post their questions in the Q&A option in your Zoom screen. Please do it through the Q&A and not through the chat. I think the chat function is disabled. We will take up your questions in the second half of the panel discussion. What we'll do in the first half is have a discussion among ourselves, and I'm going to ask a few questions to start off and warm up the discussion. The first question that I'm going to ask all the three panelists is related to the COVID pandemic itself. So maybe I'll start with Hui Leng for this question. Hui Leng, what were the supply chain challenges that your company, NTUC FairPrice, faced during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic? And how did you address it? And what have you learned from the crisis and how you address the challenges at that point of time in March and early April?
Like good students of supply chain, we all know that it is always best to ensure that your inventory holding is just in time. However, Singapore being a net importer country, we know that we are not natural producer of agricultural product. So within the supply chain of FairPrice itself, we do keep some inventory. So as to the number of days, obviously I will not be sharing here, but you know that Singapore as a whole, we do maintain certain healthy level of inventories. So the key challenges that we face during the earlier part of the pandemic is basically the speed of replenishment. Because in order to manage the cost itself of the supply chain, we are working on a very efficient model. So being efficient, obviously, you do not have too much fats in the system. Like what Prof has mentioned earlier on, we are a firm believer of Lean and Six Sigma. So we also ensure that our supply chain are actually running on a very lean mode. So the key challenges that we face is actually getting the goods out from our distribution center to our supermarket, and also subsequently from the supermarket to the stores. then if we move further upstream, we will know that suppliers themselves are also facing certain challenges, because as net importers, while we keep some inventories, we do need to replenish our inventories from the countries that are around surrounding us. So border closure, I think, is one of the key aspects that nobody really expect pre-COVID, because nobody expect that border will be closed. So the challenges that we had obviously is that other than bringing goods from the DC to the stores and store not having enough time and sufficient time to actually replenish the shelf, the other key challenges obviously is how to bring goods that are outside of Singapore back into Singapore. So I think what is fortunate for us is that Singapore do have very good diplomatic relationship with many of our other countries. So while passenger flights are not flying, the food cargo flights are actually still moving, except that obviously it comes at a much higher cost lah. So as FairPrice, we do absorb some of the additional costs and try to maintain the prices to our consumer as much as we can. Then as to tackling the distribution side, from distribution center to stores, obviously other than activating our network of deliveries, transporters and things like that, we also work with our non-traditional source of partners that typically doesn't do grocery deliveries, but because of the circuit breaker, some of them are also facing challenges because a lot of the business actually comes to a standstill. Operations are not ongoing. So we tap on all these resources that are also available in the market. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned about speed of replenishment as well as trying to get the DC to store transport as well using non-traditional sources. There's already one question which I thought was relevant from the audience. So I thought I'll raise it now itself rather than postponing it for later. So the question is, given that the COVID environment raised the cost of international freight, are there any steps that you took in order to deal with these headwinds?
Okay, obviously, this is a bigger question in the sense that the whole industry is actually facing the issues. So other than going for air freight, freight is one of it. Sea freight continues to be ongoing. So we actually do a blend of air and sea freight depending on the sensitivity of the product as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges you mentioned offline was also the fact that because the products were flying off the shelf very quickly, shelving was also a challenge, right?
Yes.
And given the fact that there were distancing restrictions, how did you manage the shelving challenge within the store itself?
Yeah, so we tried many different ways. I think those who has been to our hypermart in Ang Mo Kio will have realized that during the peak of the COVID, instead of replenishing onto the shelf, basically what we do is that we just pull the pallets of goods out, especially things like paper product, the tissue papers, the toilet roll. Instead of opening up the carton boxes, replenishing it onto the shelf, what we did is that we actually lay the pallets there, just open up the carton box. And this actually speed up the consumers, especially in terms of retrieving what they want. Because what we have to notice that during this period, the demand has actually went up like 2 to 3 times the normal demand. So replenishment definitely is one of the key issues. So what we did is we just open up and then we leave pallets of goods actually lying around the shop floor to the shelves that they typically will be stored in. Yeah.
Okay. So in summary, the challenges was threefold in the sense that you had to speed up the replenishment because the consumers were probably buying rationally because they see less on the shelf. They expect that the lead time for replenishment is going to be longer, and therefore they buy larger quantities. And because they're buying larger quantities, the products go off the shelf faster. So you needed 3 elements: overseas to the shores of Singapore, which you did through ocean freight and other air transport methods, then the store to DC, and then within the DC to store, and then within the store, finding means to replenish the shelves much faster, or using the pallets itself as shelves that you normally do during Chinese New Year and other times.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for that answer, Huling. So let me now turn to Chi Hao, and I'm going to ask Chi Hao exactly the same question as well. What were the challenges that McDonald's faced during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic? And how did you address it, and what have you learned from this?
As you might know, there's no break in McDonald's supply chain during the pandemic. And one of our key challenges earlier on is really around people safety, which is the shortage of PPE, the personal protective equipment globally. And at the same time, there's a need to ensure supply, like what Hui Ling mentioned earlier, inventory. So basically, we took a pretty normal steps about activating our contingency plan, formation of a core team, and then ensuring information flow and prioritization of tasks. And then to talk about what do we learn from this pandemic, I think the main theme is about being prepared for future waves. And some of the key insights that we see is really about being agile and looking ahead. You know, government lockdowns, they only give 24 to 48 hours notice. How do we have flexible plans around there? And controlling what we can control, you know, internal processes, inventory management, and mitigating earlier vulnerabilities that we identify, and have plans to manage the uncontrollable. You know, governments will come up with various regulations that businesses need to follow. So another insight is that communication is critical. How do we be timely, transparent, and clear, and being proactive with our stakeholder engagement? So at the same time, we also need to address what works for certain markets will not work for another market. No example, no solutions put in place will remain, and develop plans for potential scenarios to reflect lead time. And then we need to be agile in taking preemptive actions. And then lastly, I think one of the watch-outs is that we need to be continue to be aware of the evolving hygiene and safety practices as we go into this.
So if I were to summarize your response so far, the challenges for McDonald's was not predominantly about supplies itself, because I guess McDonald's works with a very close set of partners for all the supplies, and by and large the SKUs itself are limited in McDonald's in a sense, and therefore the supply chain itself didn't pose challenges. The challenges were more in terms of operations itself in the franchisees and the outlets, in terms of PPE, in terms of sourcing for cleaning liquids, and then the operational procedure itself, because in different countries, because of the lockdown, you had to follow specific procedures, and some stores had to be closed. I believe even in Singapore, McDonald's outlets were closed during the second half of April, if I remember right. So the challenges are more in terms of internal operations rather than supply chain, if I understand you correctly.
It's a kind of a reverse from Hui Ling, is that at the initial part is about excess inventory, because if restaurants are closed, how do we deal with that?
So I don't think you quite touched upon the excess inventory. So maybe we can you can elaborate on that. I guess you're implying excess inventory because of work from home and the fact that people could not go out. There was less demand for McDonald's products, and therefore you ended up with excess inventory. So how did you manage that excess inventory?
I mean, there's a few things. Definitely working with our suppliers, partners is a key, and then relook at where we the product shelf life and what we have, basic inventory management. I think, and then making sure that what do we do, and then there are procedures involved in this inventory management, and doing more others. This is also opportunity to address, like giving back to the society. That's where helping out the local community is also one of the key things that we do during this pandemic.
So you effectively gave away some of the excess inventory as food to the local community in many places. Is that, okay.
Yep, this is a part of it. Just a small part. Other that we will have to manage.
Okay. So effectively, you were able to help the community during these challenging times using the excess inventory in a sense. Good. Thank you, Jihar. So let me move to Ed now, and I'm going to ask Ed also exactly the same question, because as you can notice now, we have three diverse companies. One is in the last mile consumer facing delivery of the everyday goods that we consume at home. The other is the very large food and beverage player, McDonald's. And the third is actually in the high-tech industry, in printers, both 3D printers and traditional high-speed printers of all sizes, and as well as computers and other workstations and many other products. So very diverse companies in terms of challenges. So Ed, again, the same question. What were the supply chain challenges that HP faced during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic? How did you address it, and what have you learned from this?
All right. I guess you saved the old guy for last. Is that right? They say age before beauty.
Age before beauty, exactly.
Yeah,
yes.
So you need to turn that around.
Yeah. So the next time around, I'll go with you first, right?
Okay, we'll go the other way. Okay.
Age respect, right? So
very good. So like many in the tech industry, a large part of our supply chain and manufacturing is in China. Not all of it, and I'll elaborate that in a minute. And so there's a reason for that also. The components for electronics are a lot of the suppliers are actually in China, because the rare earth elements that are used to make the components, China is a major supplier of rare earth elements in the world, and they kind of control that supply. So there's a reason why there's a lot of tech companies manufacturing in China, and it's that to have that short supply chain between the materials, the components, and then eventually the product. And so obviously, when COVID hit, kind of China manufacturing area shut down, and so obviously we're challenged with a supply chain disruption. Now, how HP generally deals with supply chain for continuity of business is a few simple tactics, and we've done this for a couple decades. One is having a redundant supply chain. We never have a single supplier for any specific component. We don't have a single manufacturing partner for assembly. And so redundancy in your supply chain is one of the things. For components, you can imagine all of these electronic components, including processors, they're not only used in PCs, they're used in our printers. And so what we do literally with high risk components like processors is we aggregate our demand across all of our businesses. And we literally, like Chihua said, we own the inventory. For the high risk components, we increase owned inventory that we can later distribute through our different product lines. So what happened when we got this disruption is we needed to micromanage changes from one supplier to another, from one manufacturing house to another. And that's a lot of work. Honestly, our supply chain guys were working around the clock to try to keep things going. Our sales teams had to improve their forecasting for specific product lines and SKUs, and have a tighter communication with our supply chain guys, because we literally were risking running out of specific SKUs in that early spring into May. Literally it was micromanagement of SKUs, the demand versus the supply, and then micromanagement of the components necessary for those specific SKUs. So how the story ended. In our Q2, which is actually February, March, April, we ran out of certain SKUs. If you run out of an SKU, what is the option for a customer? You either try to sell them up, you try to sell them down, you try to convince them to wait, or they go to the competition and they buy, right? And a lot of times you can imagine if a guy's looking for a certain level of PC, he's looking for that level of PC. So to compound our supply chain disruption, people started working at home. And all of a sudden, people find that they need more laptops at home, and they need laptop upgrades at home so that they can do virtual sessions like we're doing today. So our demand for home PCs kind of skyrocketed on us because people, one laptop at home was no longer enough. Plus, because people had to work at home, they had to study at home. And believe it or not, our gaming PCs, the demand went way up because people are stuck in their home and they have nothing to do outside of work except, play games on their PCs. So our problem was compounded because our supply was disrupted at the same time that demand went up. Our Q2, we had good results, but we did run out of certain SKUs. And the question is, how many sales did we lose because we ran out of those SKUs? As an indicator of possibly we lost a good number of sales, our Q3, which is May, June, and July, was a record. It was a record quarter for unit sales of PCs because we got, after all that micromanagement, we got our supply chain together and we matched supply to demand, and we had record PC results for Q3. That indicates that we probably lost sales in Q2, although we met more than the expectations of sales. So the learning is that all of this micromanagement, and quite honestly, HP has a size of business that we can kind of strong arm our suppliers and supply chain. What we found is that's not enough. If you have this situation where your supply chain is disrupted and your demand goes up, micromanaging your supply, it just is not enough. And so I suppose the next question is, what are we going to do different? Right? I won't answer it until you ask, Vish.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I guess to summarize your response, in Q2, you had some supply chain issues in spite of the redundancy in supply chains and the nitty-gritty level of attention to the coordination between the sales, forecasting, and the supply chain teams. You think that you lost some of the sales, but that probably cannot be established easily because maybe even the competitors were having problems too. And eventually the consumers actually came back and brought the products from HP itself. Because as you all know, in China, the pandemic ended very quickly and the supply chains were back up by April or May. And that's when you had your best quarter ever in a sense. So you mentioned about HP already having redundancy in the supply chain. So this is a very quick factual question. Was the redundancy in terms of multiple sources within China itself, or were they across countries?
We tend to try to have a short supply chain, as I think Hui Lang mentioned. You try to have just in time, and so you tend to, for a product line, have the components and the assembly very near each other. Having said that, we don't do all of our manufacturing in China. We've got for our pen, for our print heads, we've got basically our manufacturing is in Singapore, and we have a limited production line in Corvallis, Oregon, and that's our redundancy. Singapore is our efficient, high volume manufacturing. Corvallis is our flexible, lower production volume assembly line. So we do have some ability to switch countries, but they're difficult to manage. You don't just, it's not digital. You don't flip a switch. As an example, PCs are simple assembly. They're modules and you kind of like piece them together. You could do that assembly. We could do it in my garage if we want. Our larger printers, including our large format printers that are actually assembled in Malaysia, our 3D printers that are also assembled in Malaysia, there's 4,000 parts. There's more than 4,000 parts that go into that. If we move that to somewhere else, we have to have a supply chain for 4,000 parts that follows it. That's a lot of work. That is a lot of work. And so there is redundancy of both components and assembly, and it's not all within China, and that does save us a lot of times. It's still, our learning is it's not enough.
Okay. So yeah, so to summarize your response, meeting demand was a challenge initially, but by Q3, when the demand for computers went up because of work from home, especially gaming computers, you were able to meet the demand because of having planned the attention to detail for the redundancy. But just because you have redundant supply chain is not enough, because you need to build in the processes to activate the redundancy. And I suspect from what you mentioned also is the redundancy you have is sort of quite different. The printers manufactured in Singapore are quite different from the ones in China. Yeah. And the facility in Koval is more of a test facility for flexibility. And the underlying suppliers for, even if you have dual sourcing in terms of suppliers, for the manufacturing that takes place in China, probably the suppliers come from the same region within China itself, in a sense, yeah, which obviously doesn't help for building redundancy. I also wanted to add a other point here in terms of globalization. One of the reasons globalization happens whole scale is, I mean, the HP is a classic example. Initially, you outsource some parts to China from the point of view of saving on labor costs. But then you find that it's actually good to co-locate the entire assembly and suppliers and components within the same region itself. And therefore, you have a situation where, and this is true for many global manufacturing companies, all their manufacturing right from components all the way till the finished assembly is within a small region itself within the world. Yeah. And that's when the disruption challenges emerge. So I want to move to the next question now. And this time, as I promised, Ed, I'll start the other way around.
Start with the old guy.
So maybe we'll have a shorter response for this so that we can eventually get to the audience questions as well. So Ed, based on your learning, not just in the last 6 months from the COVID, but I mean, as I mentioned at the introduction, companies have been grappling with supply chain disruption management for the past 20, 25 years. But unfortunately, once the disruption event passes away, people go merrily back to cost optimization, because ultimately a lot of companies compete on costs, because whether it's McDonald's, whether it's HP, customers also care about the cost in a sense. So based on your learning in the past, what are the strategies and tactics that HP wants to have in place to ensure resiliency in your supply chain in the future? Yeah. And how would this be different from what you have done in the past?
Yeah, so you know it because you and I are working on it. So what we're working on, looking at. So one thing is that this Q2, Q3 situation caught the attention at a very high level, and so from the top, what we heard is, look, we have to not only focus on cost, but focus on resiliency, cost and resiliency. And as you know, what we've been working on is what's called a hybrid supply chain. If you look up the term hybrid supply chain, it's a supply chain which has both a cost-effective method and an agile method incorporated for the same element. Okay, an example would be actually what Hui Leng mentioned. Air freight is agile. Sea freight is cost effective. There is an example of having a hybrid supply chain or a hybrid supply chain element. And so what we started looking at is, look, we don't have to have all 100% cost effective method. We need to blend a hybrid supply chain where you have a cost effective and complement that with an agile method. Our pen line in Corvallis is not a test line. It is a production facility which is more easily configurable and can do low volume manufacturing. And when you say low volume for print heads, you're still talking about hundreds of thousands of print heads, but it's less cost efficient than our Singapore line, which is more rigid and harder to change. And so that's another example of hybrid supply chain. Now, what you do with a hybrid supply chain is that you're cost effective ends up being what they call the push supply chain. You sell what you made, and your agile ends up being your pull supply chain. Whatever's your upside, you do it with the agile. And so what we're looking at is, how do we make a better financial decision as to what's the optimum balance between push and pull? And you know, I think it was also mentioned here. It's like, how much inventory do you hold versus how much do you do just in time? That's push versus pull. That's exactly push versus pull. So as you know, Vish, we're contemplating hybrid supply chains, and how does one make a better decision in terms of balancing push versus pull for how much of the supply comes from your cost effective and how much of your supply comes from the agile method, and to use them coincidentally always to the optimum point, which is the decision model that you and I are working on as part of our investigation at your business school.
Okay, thank you for the response, Ed. So in sort of summary, probably the future challenges. So in the supply chain literature itself, people talk about flexibility and functionality or cost efficient as two separate options. There is a very celebrated Harvard Business Review article that all business school students go through when they take an introductory course in supply chain. Now the challenge is, how do you build both agility and cost effectiveness, flexibility and cost effectiveness into a supply chain, and possibly have hybrid supply chain? And that's one of the things that we are researching for the future. How can we bring that in, right? So let me quickly also go to Chi Hao and Hui Ling for a very short response on what they think about this because I see already quite a lot of questions from the audience, almost 16 of them, and hopefully we can get to that very quickly. So 2 minutes each for Chi Hao and Hui Ling. So based on your learning in the past, what are the strategies and tactics that McDonald's want to take to ensure resiliency in your supply chain, and how is it different from what you addressed in the past?
So I'll do this very quickly. I think I'm in a unique position where I've been in the high-tech supply chain and right now in the food supply chain. So in the food supply chain, one thing for sure is that we know that risk is going to increase post-COVID. You know, markets that have product that have sourcing claims, I think this will be a high risk. And then we talked about earlier is the risk of closed border import disruptions, which is rising, especially examples that we see in the Asia markets with their international trade restriction during the COVID situation. And then that really introduced greater risk to resiliency and the need to evaluate local sourcing and storage options. So I guess the steps that needs to be taken is really increasing risk mitigation, enhancing category roadmaps, and then addressing risk mitigation priorities. I think one of the top priorities in mitigating actions is about shelf life review, increase inventory, storage capacity, supply diversification, flexible formulations, and improve forecasting tools. This is definitely some of the standard things that will be done. And then another interesting point to bring up is that COVID has brought in even sharper focus on the need to have robust, diverse, sustainable raw material supply chains. Challenges such as climate change, water scarcity, farmer economic viability, animal-borne disease already impact the availability and affordability of raw materials. So to build more resiliency into key raw material supply chain, we really need to address this and other challenges, as well as to continue to meet customers, shareholders, stakeholders' expectation in areas of human rights, animal welfare, protecting forests and nature. Innovation can help us, looking at the pioneering work around agro-tech and data collection. So at the end of the day, just for a quick conclusion, is finding that right balance, reassessing sourcing approach by category to further strengthen supply chain resilience, while still balancing the critical elements of cost and quality, as well as customers and external stakeholders' expectation. So resilient activities and markets will be prioritized alongside with robust trade-off analysis of cost and benefits. So that's I want to conclude here.
Okay, thank you, Chiha. So if I were to summarize it, the challenge of having hybrid supply chain in the sense of both cost and resiliency is also important to McDonald's. But the other points you brought up were McDonald's has a unique challenge of managing the shelf life because you're dealing with perishable product.
Yep.
And then you touched on an entirely different topic. We might not have that much time to address it, but maybe when we address the audience questions, we'll probably touch upon it. The sustainability of the supply chains, the sourcing, taking care of the farmers. And this is a huge issue going forward in the food supply chains. In fact, recently the Minister for Environment, the previous Minister for Environment raised the 30 by 30 challenge, right? Because there is more push for localization of produce and food. And Singapore, food security is a very important issue for Singapore. So for example, we have always maintained, and this might not be known, I mean, the people in the industry know it, Singapore actually keeps a huge amount of reserves of rice in stock. And that was actually one of the reasons that NTUC FairPrice itself was founded, because as rice-eating Asian people and being a small red dot, where we almost import everything that we consume, and for a long time, even water, right? We don't want to run out of rice at any point in time. So I think that's an assurance given by the government itself. We'll never run out of rice because we do keep how much amount of the stock only people in the government will know, but we do keep, right? So the next strategy Singapore is pushing for is 30 by 30, where 30% of our food actually comes from local sources, and there is a lot of research efforts going into that as well. So I want to ask exactly the same question to Hui Ling as well, and probably she will talk about some of these challenges. How is NTUC FairPrice looking at the future resiliency in supply chain, and what are the strategies and tactics that you want to pursue in the future?
Yeah. So being in the food industry, we are no different from the high-tech industry. So the magic word continue to remain as diversification. So we are also diversifying our source of supply. So, but there's a little trick to the diversification though, is that in the past, when we talk about diversification, we tend to look at a country, but going for different suppliers. But you most probably still goes to a few selected countries. But with COVID, what has changed obviously is that because of border closure, we start to look at diversifications by countries. So typically, Singaporeans like Thai rice. So a lot of time you get most of your rice from Thailand. But we also know that there could be many, many suppliers. So the diversification then is looking at the various suppliers within Thailand. But moving forward, or actually what we are really doing is that from the supermarket, you'll see that we also have Vietnamese rice. So there is nothing that is stopping us in future to move on to rice from Cambodia and many, many other countries. Even India, we have the basmati rice as well. So I think the diversification word has actually taken a twist because of COVID, is that we are looking more at diversification by countries. However, there are some key challenges that we obviously face when you look at diversification by countries. As consumers, we have certain eating habits and eating patterns. So if you are so used to the A brand tuna, it's very, very hard and not easy to switch to a C brand tuna, a S brand tuna, or even a T brand tuna. So I think this is one of the key challenges that moving forward, not just from a supermarket perspective, but also from an industry perspective, is that we have to start to educate our consumers. And during normal time, it is good to provide a little bit of varieties, and consumers should also make an attempt perhaps to try the various brands that are in the market instead of sticking to your favorite brands. Because during crisis, sometimes the supply are still available, but you most probably don't have the unique brand that you wanted.
Okay, thank you, Hui Ling, for that response. So we have lots of questions in the Q&A box from the audience, and we probably have only about 15-20 minutes, and I'm going to try to address some of the questions. And I'm sort of doing it in a random order. I guess the first question I'll probably take up is building more redundancy across far-flung supply chains to tackle disruption will increase cost, and global transportation costs may permanently increase, which I probably agree, especially if you bring in carbon tax or pricing into the transportation costs. would there be a tipping point where manufacturing would be onshored in countries where goods are consumed? And this is a thing that people keep discussing all the time. Even Obama had a discussion with Steve Jobs once upon a time, but maybe I should ask the panelists this question. Will there be a tipping point where manufacturing will be onshored into countries where they're consumed? Who wants to take that question?
You know, I'll take the first crack at it if you want. Onshore versus offshore, you know, for these multiple part products, it's kind of a funny question, because like you indicated, Vish, you do the assembly and the components, and you have a short supply chain. If people think that the supply chain for automobiles is long, you don't know automobile supply chains. You build the car where it makes economic sense to build the car. You do the sub-assemblies near there. You do the component assemblies or component fabrication near there. You know, so I don't see necessarily us breaking up supply chains country by country or city by city. You'll continue to want to have a consolidated supply chain. Now, having said that, I think that actually the optimum is not a completely centralized product supply, but rather a hybrid model where you have, again, most of the manufacturing where it's most cost effective and some redundancy somewhere else. And as they're worldwide products, I'm sorry, if you're distributing them around the world and you fabricated them in Singapore versus China, the carbon footprint doesn't change. It doesn't. You do the math. Redundancy doesn't add carbon footprint for a worldwide product. So that's what I believe. Now, in the long term, you know, my vision of 3D printing is that we can print electromechanical robotic mechanisms without further assembly. You know, 100 years from now, then you can do local fabrication. But until you can fabricate products instead of parts, it's going to be it's going to be mostly centralized somewhere.
Okay, yeah. So unless you achieve a real true vision of Industry 4.0, where you have a completely automated manufacturing facility, in some cases it does happen when there is a high degree of automation. Onshoring does take place, but then supply chains are huge, and so in many products, components are also manufactured. That said, it depends on the companies too. So for example, in Toyota, maybe they manufacture Corolla in one country, Camrys in another country, and so on. So let me go to the next question here. I think there's a question for Huileng. What would you do if consumers are not brand conscious, but country or produce conscious due to COVID-19? Example, I've noticed certain fruits from countries, Australia have been out of stock of NTU's online shop for long stretches. How do you answer that question?
Okay. So if consumers are not brand conscious but country conscious, so that goes back to the same question. Because if the border is closed, literally there's nothing much that we can do. You know, if they are not exporting, there's nothing we can do. So like Australia, what are the typical items that is coming from Australia? We have, if we talk about vegetables, we have the carrots, we have the broccoli. But are there countries that are offering carrots and broccoli? I'm quite sure that China, for instance, will have it. So ultimately, I think because Singapore, we are not producing all these agricultural products ourselves. So to a certain extent, whatever resiliencies that we can build, we have to accept the reality is that we are still depending very much in terms of import. So if you ask me whether brand conscious versus country conscious, is there a difference? To me, I feel that there's no difference. So does China carrots taste slightly different from Australia carrots? Perhaps, but ultimately they are still carrots and they are still fiber that we need to consume.
Okay, so the consumers have no choice.
Yes, correct. So I guess when you have no choice, it's not really something that we can do. In fact, if you take a look at it, if you talk about vegetables, you're country conscious, but would you then try to taste or try frozen carrots then? Because we could have frozen carrots from Australia if you are very conscious about the country, but would we be able to adjust to frozen carrots? I think a lot of time these are actually individual preference and consumer preference.
Okay. Maybe I should also ask that question to Chihao, because I know in McDonald's, I do recall advertisements, at least when I was in the United States, they always say 100% American beef or 100% American potatoes. So you do sell certain products based on the source of the produce itself. So how do you deal with it when you have such an issue where the borders are closed?
So this this is what I mentioned under product claim. If you sell a product and you make certain claims about it, so this pandemic has really highlighted. So it's really for the business to take a decision that where you make claims about this coming from local farms and then from particular source, it really restricts your options. And then when you have made such a claim to the consumer, so that's been highlighted, and then they will have to be how about the diversification, and then that really limits option supply, and they will have to study various options whether that is something that's feasible going forward if you make such a claim, or that's something that you have to study your resiliency in terms of your local supply. Yep.
Yeah, of course.
What can I comment? I'm sorry to laugh. I'm sorry to laugh, but the most interesting claim that I saw from McDonald's back in the 1980s, I was in Canada, and the breakfast sandwich advertised specifically that the Egg McMuffin had real American Canadian bacon. Like, I'm in Canada. Like, so apparently the Canadians prefer that the Canadian bacon is American.
So yeah, I mean, this is an interesting issue that will go on for because of the consumer preference in various markets. Yep.
But I guess the movement is going towards more local produce and local consumption, and that's where Singapore has also issued this 30 by 30 challenge, primarily for food security as well as for sustainability concerns, because you want to avoid the long transportation of the products in a sense. But on the other hand, we have the challenge of having enough food for people by 2050 or 2060. So I guess consumers also have to accept the fact that the food we eat will be coming from different countries and through different processes, because there might not be enough food for everybody unless we come up with very strong research and innovations, which is something that Singapore government is also trying to pursue. So let me try to address as many questions as possible. So there's one question specifically for Ed. For HP, how has the pandemic resulted in HP to, maybe you've already answered this, do you think there will be a radical departure from current practices of reliance on China?
Not while China is a cost-effective supply chain, you know. So what tends to drive all decisions are financials. You know, I'm sorry, but if it's most cost-effective in China, the decisions will be driven there. This is why you know, the president tries to start to have tariff wars to balance out the financials. Eventually, if India develops the capabilities of manufacturing and is less expensive than China, I see manufacturing moving to India. Being the least expensive in the world is only a temporary condition. And Singapore knows that, and Singapore literally, intentionally moved up the value chain back in the 1990s. As I'm in Singapore looking at part providers, not assemblers. And the part providers said, look, our plan is to get into assembly, and then we're going to do product assembly. And then when we do product assembly, we'll do cost reduction design, and then we'll do design. That's an intentional increase in the value chain, because Singapore knew that low cost was not going to be their value added as the cost of living increased. And so I think the same thing will eventually happen with China. It's already happening. If you look at the cost efficiencies of China as the labor costs have increased, it's not that great of a deal anymore And it's a matter of time before other countries take over the low-cost manufacturing. So I think decision based on pandemic, China versus not China, zero impact. Will we eventually move out of China? Everybody will, because it'll be less expensive to manufacture somewhere else.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Ed, for that response. Let me, I see more questions, and I'm going to take up some related to, so there's one question specifically for Chihar. I think you partly addressed it already, and this is from one of my faculty colleagues, old-time faculty colleague. He says, please, I think you mentioned about the flexible formulation, and this was also in the context of discussion about product provenance and sourcing and so on. How much can you vary the formulations given product quality and safety concerns?
So actually, this is pure food science. You know, there's a whole technology behind food science. As long as it's safe, and the limits of I'm not a tech, because there's a whole technology and expertise around that. As long as it's meet the food safety, the quality, and the sensory, is how do you play around with that form within that parameters and assuring, rather to have a rather fixed. So that's where a big team of technologists will have to look at this in terms of formulation, and how do you work around there, and then making sure that all these ingredients you can diversify. It's another way of diversifying various sources, that where you can source your ingredients from. I mean, just to answer that question.
So there are two other questions I want to sort of combine. Possibly they're not exactly the same kinds of questions, but maybe to this question is both for Huiling as well as Chihar. What is your view on cold chain logistics in Southeast Asia? Is there an increasing need for that? And the other question is, what is the impact of pandemic on digitization of supply chain, especially adoption by tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers? So Huiling, on the cold chain logistics in Southeast Asia.
I think cold chain logistics is definitely growing in Southeast Asia. And in this whole pandemic, especially because of COVID-19, we also noted a trend that people are actually switching more to frozen product, because I think to get chilled and fresh poultry, meat, and whatever it is, it's becoming quite challenging during this period. So definitely in the whole Southeast Asia, the cold chain logistics is something that a lot of people are actually looking at, not just within Singapore. We know that even in countries like Philippines, Indonesia, they are also building up their cold warehouses. Yeah. That's what we have noted, during this period of time.
And I guess having cold chain logistics is very important in the Asian food supply chain, because
yes, correct.
There's a lot of wastage of food at the source itself tremendously. And
Yeah.
I mean, and to address the food challenges for the world, cold chain is
yes,
especially in developing countries like India.
yeah, and to a certain extent, because frozen items tends to have longer shelf life. So when it comes to the maintenance and also the storage itself, it makes a lot more sense, because shelf life for fresh items are typically a lot more shorter.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is a question for all three. What is the impact of pandemic on digitization of supply chains, especially tier 2 and tier 3? So maybe I'll start with Chihar first and then go to the other two panelists. The impact of
I think digitization is a key. It's an ongoing thing, and then pandemic just really brings up the urgency of this, be it tier 2 or tier 3. So digitization is really helping to build supply chain into a better supply chain or resiliency, because there are tools out there. So for organization, this is something definitely my organization is one of our priorities. And having tools that can help us, be it business intelligence software that helps to look at contingency and things like that. I mean, I'll just state an example when it comes to planning contingency, because if you use a human to rank the risk, be it in a traffic light, red, green, or what, in various factors, there's always this human factor when it comes to this when you're doing your plans. But if you put in a system or business intelligence kind of software, it sort of take care of it for you from a business with the vast amount of data that really helps you, and it helps to pinpoint for a global organization where are your pain points in terms of capacity and things like that. So this is just an example, and then it will continue to be a priority. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Hui Leng, would you also?
Yeah, I think my response is quite similar to Chi Hao. I think one thing that we are working on even before the pandemic is that digitalization of the processes, digitalizations in terms of the data. These are definitely the trend that everybody is moving towards too. So what is important for us is that actually it provides visibility on the end-to-end supply chain, which will actually helps the whole supply chain itself to respond on a timely manner and response to crisis as and when required. Yeah, so that is definitely the way to move in the coming months and years. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ed?
Yeah, so in terms of supply chain, I actually would say exactly the same, but there's a bigger trend, which is the digitization of the entire product life cycle for something like the products that we do, and the use of the data across the entire life cycle to make the entire product life cycle more efficient is what's known as Industry 4.0, and that is happening and will happen with or without pandemics. Just to stay competitive, you have to digitize your product life cycle. It also enables other business models when you can use that data to offer additional services to your customers, or to offer higher quality products to your customers. So I think it's essential with or without a pandemic.
And I guess what Ed is talking about is digitization of the product development cycle itself, the product design, so that you're able to customize based on what the customer wants and quickly launch new products as quickly as possible, right? So we are actually already running out of time. So I'm going to take another 3 to 5 minutes before we end the webinar. There's lots of interesting questions. I think some of them we have already answered. So I'm going to touch upon one topic before we end. And I think that's something we discussed earlier offline, is to address the challenge of building resiliency into supply chains. One possible way might be for competitors to collaborate and in building the resiliency. And I think Hui Leng mentioned that in the conversation. So do you think players in the supply chain can collaborate together to build resiliency in the supply chain? And if so, what is happening in your own respective industries? So maybe I'll start with Hui Leng first and then go to the others.
Okay, I guess nothing is impossible, and especially in the light of a pandemic. So when it comes to working with or collaborating with competitors, I can look at it from two angles. It could be collaborating from the supply chain perspective, more on the logistic front, which I'm quite sure that during this period, actually a lot of the competitors are actually working together. In fact, as it is from an industry angle, there are many sort of like a common platform that are being developed, like where you can check for truck availability, even at the various ports and things like that. So I don't preclude that there's this possibility that we could collaborate with competitors in the light of needs as well. Yeah.
Okay. Very quick responses from Chi Hao as well as Ed on this.
So on competitors analysis, I believe they are already platform to do it in terms of like trade association or that categories body, like an international or trade body with membership and people get to together to discuss. So those are the existing platform whereby is there going to be really at the end of the day there's still competition between competitors, and then what collectively you want to do good and driving certain standards that have efficiency. So I guess this association and trade bodies will be the one that's driving such a agenda, but typically it'll take quite some time to get everybody aligned, and then such bodies do meet on a regular basis. So they are going on forward. in my sense. So, but my company, other areas, we have you can check online the skill for good, taking the skill that we have to lead in some of these areas. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very quick response, Ed, as well on.
Yes. So, so in industries where you're really trying to differentiate your products somehow based on performance and functionality, I generally don't think so, but it's a function of the product type and the industry. And I'll just give you an example. If the product is a sort of commodity, and I'll even say PCs, low-end PCs, all the components are the same, all the screens are the same, all the processors are the same. For commodity, probably. So commodity products, there's an opportunity. And then certain industries where you've actually somehow got a hyper competitive situation. And I'll take automobile as an example. Automobile manufacturer has several times more capacity than demand every single year. There's not enough demand for the quantity of automobile players in the world, the quantity of brands. And so you see, because it's such a competitive market, you see sharing of components, you see sharing of motors, you see sharing of investments for the electrification of automobiles, because in fact, no one player is ever going to get their money back in investing in the electrification of their vehicles. And so you do see major collaboration because no one player has aggregated enough business for them to drive differentiation, and so they share. And so I think as a function of product type and industry, you'll see sharing. Otherwise, people will be driven to differentiate themselves, which means not sharing components.
Okay. So thank you for that. So I think we are almost running out of time. So let me try to, it's very difficult to summarize all the rich issues that we discussed in less than a couple of minutes. But essentially, there's a challenge between building resiliency in supply chain and making them cost effective. So one possibility is to build up hybrid supply chains where you can try to trade off between the two very well. Whether we will onshore is a debate that we've been having for more than 20 years now. It doesn't look like manufacturing will move out of China anytime soon because they have developed deep competencies there over a period of time. And the supply chain challenges are unique for each of the industries that the panelists represented today. So I want to sort of end here, but I want to have the last word for the panelists as well. So very quick final thoughts to share in 15 seconds from each one of you. Let me go with Ed first, and Chihar, and then Hui-Ling. Ed.
Yeah. So I think we've said a lot here, so it's hard to overall summarize. But I'd say this really it literally is an exciting time for supply chain because people are realizing that purely cost efficiency is not the right blend. And so, I'm a proponent of hybrid supply chains, but maybe there's other methodologies that help us build resiliency. And I've never seen so much excitement about the topic of supply chain as I see today. So, I thank you for letting me participate in the event. Vish, I hope this has been interesting for the audience.
Thank you, Ed. Chihar?
Yeah, for me, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I mean, I just want to say that, no, this is only an hour, but this is a huge topic to cover everything. And it really varies industry by industry. And then there are many areas to cover, and finding the right balance require really cross-functional efforts and being agile at the same time. So I just want to end with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chihar. Hui-Ling?
Yeah, thanks, Prof. Thanks for having me. I guess I agree with Edward in the sense that I think supply chain has never gained so much attention in the last many years as compared to the last few months. So I guess for all the supply chain practitioner and even for people who has never heard about supply chain or has been waiting to see whether they want to join the supply chain industry, I thought this is the best time for people to come in. There are a lot of happenings within the supply chain itself, not about effectiveness, efficiency, but we talk about resiliencies as well. So there are many things that is happening now, and even the Singapore government 30-30 initiative. I thought there are a lot more to read that if we can get more people on board, is something that will actually help us to work it out. Yeah.
So I guess lots of opportunities in terms of career opportunities as well as in the field, especially when you can combine sustainability with supply chains.
Yeah.
So that's a huge growing area as a topic. So I'd like to thank the audience for all the fantastic questions that you sent us. We were, of course, not able to address all of them because it's a very short 1 hour webinar, and which we have exceeded by 10 minutes already. So thank you very much for the audience for attending this seminar. And thank you to all the 3 panelists, Ed, Chihar, and Huilang, for the very interesting and fantastic discussion. I would also urge the audience to look out for our Knowledge Lab webinar, future webinars. They will be sent to you by email if you have already registered for this webinar. And they're also posted in our school website. And I think there are more ones coming up. I think there's one next week as well, and more in November, right? So look forward to seeing all the audience in future webinars from the Nanyang Business School. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.